Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian LeMasters. Before we begin this episode, I wanted to ask you guys and let you know that we began this podcast really almost as a service to the Mount Juliet congregation in particular, but we would love for the opportunity to share this with more people. We put a lot of study into this and a lot of work preparing for this, and we would like for it to impact the kingdom as much as possible. So we encourage you to share this link to our podcast with any of your friends or on your social media. Brian and I don't receive any compensation or anything for the number of listeners or anything like that. This is free service of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ that we do as part of our work here, but we would just love to be able to share the word of the Lord with everybody that we can, and extend this out to as many people as might have an interest in it. So we'd appreciate it if you don't mind to share that and share this link with a friend.
This week, we are going to be continuing our series that's entitled Her Majesty. It's going to be week 3. We're going to be looking at Esther, and this will be our final episode of Season 3. We'll be back for the beginning of Season 4 in late August. So hopefully you don't miss us too much between now and then.
But they're going to miss us.
We got some good ideas for the fall of what we may be studying. I guess I can go and share some of them, but one of them is we're looking at a study of Satan and demons. Got some other stuff that we're going to look at as well, but probably open up with that study here in a few months. So, Tim, as we look at Esther, this can be a little bit different than our first two of looking at queens because we have a whole book about Esther. Mm-hmm. So before we jump into that, you want to go ahead and give us a little bit of the historical context?
Yeah, we need to always realize where we are in biblical history and really human history, and this has really got a lot of interesting parallels. This time, during the 5th century, a lot of things were going on other places in the world, very important things. I mentioned some of those people whose names might be familiar with or events that might be familiar with you, but where we were with Jezebel in the middle of the kingdom period in Israel, with our last study, this is many years later, centuries later, where this is even after the northern kingdom had been conquered by Assyria, the kingdom that Ahab was king over that we talked about in the last episode, and then even after the southern kingdom of Judah had been conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the temple destroyed, thousands of Jews had been exported and taken off into captivity into Babylon. And then, as we can read in the Bible, especially when we get to the time period of Ezra, the beginning part of the book of Ezra, not necessarily Ezra's time, but the beginning of the book of Ezra, we get into the Jews being allowed to return to their homeland around about 539 BCE, when Cyrus II of Persia conquers the Babylonians. They're allowed to go back. They rebuild the temple in about 517 or 516. And so the Persians are in charge. This dynasty is known as the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It lasted from about 550 to 330 BCE. It was conquered by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And we have a little bit of challenge and ask, who is the king here? Ahasuerus is what's listed. Many people think that's a royal throne name for whoever is king. But that the actual king was Xerxes I. He reigned from 486 to 465 over the Persian Empire. Many people may be familiar with Xerxes with his wars against the Greeks that have maybe if you've ever studied ancient history, you see that. But we think it was Xerxes, but Xerxes and Darius, many of these Persian king names are given by their Greek historians. And so we think Ahasuerus was just a name, kind of like we might say Pharaoh. Referring to a royal position more than that. We see that it's in the royal city of Susa. It is a very, very ancient city. It dates back over 5,000 years from the time that this was going on. And there were other capitals. We kind of think about empires like the United States is really not an empire, but a nation having one capital. But there were several cities that the king of Persia might occupy and do government business with, depending on the time of year. And so this takes place, though this story takes place in the city of Susa, and in the 3rd year of Ahasuerus, which would be around 483 BCE. Some contemporary books that we might think are close to being contemporary are Daniel. Daniel was still alive when the Persian Empire took over. Ezra and Nehemiah would be somewhat, at least close in time to this. The prophets of Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And then probably the composition of 1st and 2nd Chronicles would be things that would be similar in time to this from a biblical perspective. Would you like to know what else was going on in the world at this time, Brian?
Are you going to tell us the cost of like gas and bread?
Yes, you would not believe. Eggs. Eggs were high back then because all the chickens in Persia had the bird flu. But luckily, they had a guy who came in and took care of all those things. But yes, some familiar names maybe to some people. Socrates was around the middle of the 4th century to the beginning of the, mid 5th century to the beginning of the 4th century. Pericles, the great Athenian brought democracy to Athens. The Peloponnesian Wars between Greece and Sparta, many people have kind of seen stories about those. You remember your Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was alive pretty close to this time. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, the big wars between Greece and Persia, which would involve things like the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, the end of the 300 many people know about, other famous battles, Salamis Straits, things that happened, major wars that really were an influence and changed the course of Western civilization. If Persia had beaten Greece and kept on marching, maybe even taking over the Roman Republic, which was founded just about 20 years before this story takes place, we may have a very different Europe even today from that. And you also knew, I know, that Confucius was alive pretty close to this time, and also Siddhartha Gautama, who you know is the Buddha. And so he's late 6th century, early 5th century. So
didn't know him by the other names.
You didn't know him by that, but Confucianism and Buddhism begin to flourish around this time period as well. So a lot of things are going on in the 5th century BCE, a lot of important things in Greek history, philosophy, the culture of Greece, Athens growing to strength and power. And so very, very important time. And this is the time that this is set in. Are you asleep? Right. Wake up. Wake up, yeah. Brian dozed off over there.
Yeah.
That's all I've got on that.
All right. Well, let's jump into the story here. In chapter 1, we see King Ahasuerus. He's called a 7-day feast and calls for his queen to come as he wants to show her beauty. She's also hosting a banquet celebration for the women as well. So Vashti refuses to come, and one of his eunuchs says, "Hey, you're going to mess us up for men everywhere." He's like, "Hey, if you don't punish her, like all women are going to hear about this and they're going to have contempt towards their husbands. So you have to deal with this." He listens to that advice, and she no longer has a presence before the king. In chapter 2, it opens up letting us know that once his anger wore off, the king was kind of lonely. He missed his queen. So they call all the beautiful virgins were sought out for the king. And this is when we get introduced to Esther and also to a man named Mordecai, who is a Jew. And Tim referenced that he's carried away from Jerusalem during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. You want to give us a little bit of background or thoughts on what that could mean or not mean?
Yeah, it's one of the historical issues some people will bring up about the historicity of Esther is if Mordecai had been transported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar at that date, which I think is like 597 or something, then Mordecai would be over 120 years old by the time this story of Esther rolls around. And so scholars generally react to that by thinking this is really a reference to his people. His ancestors had been brought over with, is it Joachim? Who is it that's brought over? I can't remember it in the text of who that was that was brought over. That issue is really not a historical issue because it just really means his Jeconiah was the one brought over in Esther 2:6 is what you were referring to a minute ago. That'd be a little bit old for him to be that age. So really they think it just really means his ancestors were brought over at that time, because I don't think it makes sense for Mordecai to be that old.
Yeah, and why would Mordecai still be here?
What do you mean
still in this location? Yeah.
Well, many people didn't. Of course, this is not even Babylon. This is a whole different city than Babylon. This is several miles to the east of Babylon in what would be more like modern-day Iran, whereas Babylon is in modern-day Iraq. Most of the Jews didn't. Well, I say most. I don't know the quantity, but only like less than 5,000 Jews got deported. I think the numbers that were given about that in the Bible, or maybe it's Josephus that gives us those numbers. A lot of them didn't go back. They had made their life there, and they had, begun living there. I mean, Esther's not even it's a Persian name, not or Persian Babylonian name, not even a Hebrew name. But I think a lot of them stayed because that's where they had made their life and even continue to stay. Some people think maybe Peter, when he's addressing those in Babylon, some people think he's referring to Rome, but he may very well be talking about Jews that are actually in the city of Babylon. And so many didn't come back. I think
and if you read through this book, you'll see that there's a presence of Jews there in the city. So
whole point of the book. So not everybody went back. We act like there's a massive exodus to come back. But like, for example, Daniel didn't go back.
Mm-hmm.
He was hired again by the Persians.
Yeah.
So,
but I think we view it as in like, oh, they're all taken and then they all leave.
No, that's not.
It's not.
I don't think so at all.
All right. So you have Mordecai, and he is the uncle of her, but ends up raising her as her own because she doesn't have parents. So
that's what I was trying to figure out. Are they cousins?
Well, it says he references like I think he's the uncle of either her or the uncle of her dad. I'm trying to think how it's worded. Like it reads it weird.
It's almost like he's the son of her uncle or something. I'm trying to remember how it said. I hear people often say her uncle Mordecai. It's almost like, but I guess
I just lost
cousins. But anyway,
but yeah,
kinfolk.
He raises her as one of his own because her parents are not in the story. They're not there. What is interesting is when Esther is taken away, there is a 12-month preparation period for when they're brought, and then the women are preparing themselves to then go before the king. So you got 6 months. If you think women take long in the mornings to get ready to
you stop talking, Brian.
I saw Tim's face. So like, don't let me comment on that.
Not decrease
but
our
it was 6 months with oil and myrrh, and then 6 months with spices and ointment. So don't know exactly what all that looks like, but 12 months of she's taken away, and then all these women are being prepared to go before the king. In verse 15, it acknowledges that she heeds the advice of the head kind of eunuch of the king's eunuch of what to take with her and stuff like that. And it says she was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So she goes before the king. They have their night together, and it says that he loved her more than all the other women and places the crown on her head and makes her queen there. He also pauses taxes and gives gifts so that everyone in the land would celebrate the new queen, which is kind of smart. Like,
I want a new queen every year.
You want everybody to celebrate with you, give them gifts, and kind of hold on the taxes there. Mordecai still has a presence. It references early on him sitting at the king's gate, and then at the end of chapter 2, it references that while he's at the king's gate, he finds out a plot by two of the eunuchs that want to lay their hands on him. I assume it means kill him, not just like hurt him. But he informs Esther of this information, and she's able to take that before the king and win some more favor of kind of saving the king's life there. In chapter 3, we get introduced to this guy named Haman, and he's promoted above all the other officials and all the king's servants at the gate. They were told to bow down and pay homage to him, but Mordecai did not. So you got the creation of like two enemies here, in essence. So, Tim, when I think our audience probably and us, like as Americans, think of bow down or to pay homage, we would automatically think of worship. Is that what's occurring here, or why could this mean something different than what we would normally just think worshiping this man?
I don't think based on the Persian religion it makes any sense. Now, some movies that have come out have got Xerxes thinking he's a god and all that. I think that's really not sensible. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the Persian Empire, was really monotheistic in its belief. Ahura Mazda was the supreme god, and there were a court of other deities around him. But for it to be an act of worship, I don't think the king, number one, he doesn't ask people to bow down to him and worship him. That he's going to ask people to bow down and worship an official as if they're worshiping a god just doesn't make any sense. But because we're in a Western culture and we're not accustomed to bowing to people or bowing to a king, to me it's a thing of honor. And Mordecai was not willing to acknowledge or honor Haman. Perhaps he knew Haman was a crooked person. He doesn't come across with any qualities or good qualities at all. And so I don't think it was because it was an affront to Mordecai's Judaism that he didn't bow down. I know sometimes, and that may very well be the case, it may be that he bows to no man type thing, but I don't think that makes any sense at all, because I don't think we can look throughout the Old Testament. No Jew ever bows down to anybody or bows low before somebody in honor. So I think it's more that he refused to honor Haman. But now that could be wrong on that, but I don't really know that it makes sense with the Persian religion for the king to have deified a man. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of why some people may go there is he does reveal to the other servants there that he is a Jew and kind of says, hey, I'm not going to do this because I'm a Jew. but there's some type of reasoning there, and probably respect and stuff like of him not wanting to do it. But people do know that he is a Jew at this point, where he had told Esther not to reveal what her heritage was, to keep that private. In the 12th year of Hazariah's reign, Haman cast lots month after month. And from what I could tell from this casting of lot was trying to get a sign of when it would be a good time to go and ask for a request from the king.
It was divination. They're practicing divination.
Yeah. So they're casting lots there in the 12th month. So like a year after doing this, he ends up going to the king and asking the king permission to kill all the Jews because they did not follow the law of the land, because they have their own laws. And this is all based on the disrespect he felt from Mordecai. He was like, I don't just want to kill this one man. I'm going to wait and plot to kill all of his people. And that's pretty much becomes his life goal. And it's somebody that has a lot of power here. And the king grants him this permission, but due to how big the kingdom is, it's going to take a whole year to execute this plan. So he's like, yeah, write it up. The next month they wrote up this thing, started passing it out, but it wouldn't happen for a whole year. So there is some time here to try to save the Jews. So Mordecai, along with the Jews, they all weep and lament and fast. Mordecai is able to communicate with Esther via a eunuch, and he convinces Esther to risk her life by going before the king. So in the text, it says that it had been 30 days since she was called to the king's presence. And at this time, the rule was if you go before a king without being called, if he doesn't hold up his scepter, like, you're going to be killed. So she understands, like, hey, this is not a thing you would do unless you really needed to. Like,
you
don't just come and go. Yeah, like you wait until you're called. But he convinces her and says, hey, like, this is worth you risking this to do it. So she asked all the Jews in that area to fast for 3 days. So it's not just her and Mordecai. There is a presence of Jews there. And on that third day, in chapter 5, she appears before the king and finds favor. And instead of going ahead and asking him to do this big thing, then she says, hey, will you come for a feast that I prepared and bring Haman with you as well? And he said, absolutely. Like, at this time, he said, hey, you can ask for half the kingdom and I would give it to you. So she really is in favor with the king. That evening, Haman is gloating about his riches at his home, but that he can't get past Mordecai. And he's like, something has to be done. His wife suggests that he builds a gallows and asks the king if he can hang Mordecai there. So that same night, the king can't sleep, and he had the book of deeds read to him, the Chronicles there, and it comes across Mordecai, that plot that he had discovered and shared with the king that kind of saved his life there. And he said, hey, what's been done to thank that man? And the eunuch was like, nothing. And the king asked kind of, hey, who's out waiting to come in? And he tells him Haman's out there. So he calls Haman in. He's like, hey, what should be done to somebody who the king delights to honor? And Haman is thinking, hey, he's talking about me. Right. I'm going to this banquet. The next day, I'm going to another banquet. So he talks about, oh, you should take that man and dress him in the king's clothing and ride him through the city square and all this thing. And then the king, it's so interesting to me in the story. Like, the king asked him to say, hey, you know what? Go get Mordecai, who's out at the gate, and I want you to go do this. Hey, and don't leave one thing out that you said. So
the look on Haman's face.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, this guy has everything that he could ask for, but he cannot get past this anger that he's got towards this guy. So in chapter 7, so Mordecai goes and does that. And chapter 7, at the feast that next day there, the king asks Esther, it's her and Haman and the king, and she tells the king, let my life be granted for me by my wish, and my people for my request, for I have been sold, and I and my people will be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. And Haman's right there, and he said, oh, what wicked man would do this? And she's able to say, this guy
man.
right here.
You're the man.
So he is very fearful and should be. I'm leaving out some details, but in essence, then he gets hanged on what he had built to kill Mordecai. The king calls for that to be done to him. And then chapter 8, Mordecai is then set over his house. So you got a guy that he was planning to kill one day, and then the next day he's got to go celebrate this guy. Then he dies the death that he wanted this guy to have, and then now the guy's living in his house.
We call it irony, or you can call it karma. Which one you want to do?
Yeah, so everything that he thought was going in his direction, like, did not. So Mordecai set over his house, and then Esther continues that conversation with the king and then asks him to still save his people. She's safe, Mordecai's safe, but she goes back to him and says, hey, there's no way I could live knowing this is going to happen to all my people. So he says, hey, you write up a decree, put in it whatever you want, and send it out. So this is, at this point, about 3 months have passed. 3 or 4 months have passed since the other. And she sends out a new decree where it's like, hey, the enemies that were going to kill the Jews, protect them. Nobody can hurt the Jews, and they can wipe out their enemies. So come that 9 months later, the Jews end up killing about 75,000 of their enemies on that set day. And it's that day, and the next day ended up being a day of like feasting and gladness. So you're looking at the 14th and 15th month of Adar. Is that what you say? Would say that? Yeah, A-D-A-R. Which, Tim, walk us through a little bit of like what that ends up becoming. What do we call that today?
The Feast of Purim is that's what Jews would call it today. We think Jesus may have been observing that in John 5, verse 1. He goes up in John's gospel several times for different feasts, including Passover. And so we think that's the Feast of Purim that is still celebrated today. The book of Esther is read on that feast, is my understanding. It's one of 5 different scrolls that are read on certain Jewish observances. And so that extends, would have been extant in Jesus' day, and would have been obviously, this is 500 years separated from the time of Christ, and continues to be celebrated today. It's a very poignant holiday. When you read this text, it sounds very much like Hitler's final solution for the Jews and what has been done to Jews throughout history in efforts to exterminate them. Hitler was probably the most prolific in doing that. You can see where this story, God, through Esther, of course, we'll talk, a little bit that God's name's not mentioned in the book, but this book is generally taken as showing God's providence and protection over his people, even when they're not in Palestine, even when they're outside the promised land, that he still looks and cares for his people. And godly people intervene for the Jews. And so to me, this is a very, very poignant text for Jews in their history, especially in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, like if I'm a Jew, like for that decree to be passed along where in 12 months we're all going to die. Like there's nothing the Jews could have done themselves to like save themselves. So
look how many enemies they had. They had 75,000 plus enemies. I mean, that's an enormous number of people.
Yeah. And that's not including like this king
the
that said,
the king.
we'll do this. Yeah.
That's just
like
schemers.
Yeah. So, I mean, you got to think the change in emotion and like how important this holiday would be to the Jews then, but then also like carried through there. So in chapter 10, it's very short, but in essence, Mordecai ends up being now second ranked to the king there. It's kind of how the book ends up. Tim, walk us through, that's a little bit about Esther. She plays a huge role in the history of the Bible and the Jews as a nation and a people of God. And unique in that we have a whole book dedicated to her. But the book itself is also kind of unique. You want to walk us through a little bit about the book?
It could almost be the book of Mordecai. I mean, Mordecai really is kind of the behind-the-scenes hero here. But as a collection of words, the book of Esther did have some debate about its canonicity, its inclusion in the Old Testament. I think this probably extended my understanding into the 3rd and 4th century CE in Rabbinic Judaism. It took that long for it to get viewed as canonical scripture. And we don't want to say that that's everybody disagreed on that, but there was disagreement about that. I think Song of Solomon or Song of Songs also had some issues with it being, because it's one of those things where like, well, why would we include it? For example, the book of Esther doesn't mention God at all, even by personal pronouns or even an offhand mention of, not just by name. It doesn't mention key Old Testament themes that are pervasive throughout the Old Testament: covenant, temple, prayer, sacrifice. None of those things are mentioned. As a matter of fact, here we have Esther, who's a virgin, and she loses her virginity to an uncircumcised Gentile. Nothing said about that. And so I can understand why it would be viewed as, why would this be canonical? It may be just a story about good Jews, kind of like we might say the same thing about the additions to Daniel, like Susanna and Bel and the Dragon, or a lot of the Old Testament Apocrypha, the book of Maccabees, for example. Those are heroic stories about Jews as well, it being canonical. But there is one thing that's interesting in the Greek tradition, in the Septuagint tradition, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. The book of Esther has over 100 additional verses in it that are not in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text that all of our Old Testaments are based on. If you have a New Revised Standard Version or you have a book of the Old Testament Apocrypha, it'll be listed as additions to Esther. Well, if we think that was translated in the first 2 or 3 centuries leading up to the time of Christ, well, obviously whatever version of Esther the Septuagint translators had those verses in it, but that tells me that book was then, 200 or 300 years before Jesus, was viewed as important enough to be included in the Greek translations. And not all the books were translated at one time, but at some point, that book was viewed as being important enough to translate into Greek. And some other books are as well that are not canonical. But for it to be included and have those additional verses, if you have a Catholic Bible or an Eastern Orthodox Bible, it will have that included in it as well. But it's also one of the issues with it is we have found copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other places in the Judean desert. Copies of every Old Testament book, every canonical Old Testament book have been found except for Esther. Now, every year there's some kind of phony news that they've discovered a book of Esther. And so Martin Luther thought it was absurd to have it in the canon, I think, even as late as the Protestant Reformation. And so a lot of debate about that. A question that's been asked to me in a recent study about this book is, why do you think it ever was included? Because it omits all those things. And my answer would be, okay, so it's not found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is curious when all the other Old Testament books are, but it may just very well be that either that community of people didn't view it as canonical or as worth studying and reading, or none of the copies they had survived. I mean, we have to recognize that maybe that none of the copies they survived. The only complete Old Testament book, I think, is the 1QA Isaiah scroll, which is a complete copy of Isaiah. I think that's the only complete Old Testament book. So it just may be that it didn't survive. But the fact that it is debated, Karen Jobes, a scholar, describes it as conspicuously non-religious. It is a very non-religious book compared to the prophets or any of the historical books, because it doesn't have God, any of those concepts in it. So I can understand why it was not viewed as that, but I think by the time of Christ it was. It was obviously important enough where they continued to celebrate the Feast of Purim. And so it's not referred to in the New Testament. We don't have Esther quoted or referred to. Some people think when Herodias dances for Herod and he says, ask me anything, even up to half my kingdom. You mentioned this. Some think maybe he's, making a parody of what.
Which is interesting because it's a similar setting as well.
It's a similar setting with a beautiful woman.
Not when that quote is made in Esther, but still the background.
Yeah, I mean, I think that quote, that statement is made with some hyperbole. I don't think really Xerxes was going to give Esther half his kingdom. Neither was Herod. Of course, Herod didn't have nearly a kingdom to give, but he had to be facetious in what he was saying. So that's the only time that there's even a possible allusion to it. However, Esther is not the only Old Testament book that's never quoted in the Old Testament. In the New Testament.
Yeah, for sure. And when you think about it, like, I definitely see the value of it to Jews. Like when you think about their history and not just of understanding that holiday, but just, I mean, yes, it's not seen as religious and it's seen as more just this is what occurred. But when you look at it, you definitely see the idea of the providence of God, God's ability to fulfill promises, God's ability to protect his people, even in the midst of dark periods, or, like where it looks like there's no hope, that, hey, it's a continual thing that God has used his faithful people and unfaithful people to bring about the fulfillment of his covenant with Abraham.
And some people have a strong faith that the canonical process of the Old Testament and the New Testament has some providence to it, that God has gotten, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't necessarily have that exact same view, but we have no idea who wrote Esther. We really don't know when it was written. Sometime after the time of Esther, sometime in the probably early 4th century, late 5th century, all the way to 3rd century. We don't know that authorship. Even the name of the book is disagreed with, because Esther, I think her Hebrew name is Hadassah. Esther is a many people think is related to Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess, that she has like a Babylonian, or Astara is the Hebrew word for star. Maybe she has a Persian name, but that's not a real big deal. We know that Daniel was given a Babylonian name. We call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by their Babylonian names and not by their Hebrew names because it just sounds better in the song and singing.
They're easier to say.
They're easier to say. I can't even remember what the other is, Azariah, and I can't remember what the other two's name are. But we don't, and with authorship, we don't know who wrote most of the Old Testament. We really don't. There's wild guesses at the beginning. Everybody study Bible, but we really don't know. We don't know who wrote many of the books even ones that have the name of the person on top of it. But I do think it's fair that God wants this book in the canon. It's not been argued by anybody really in Judaism for a very, very long time. Like I said, there's still some debate about it, even in Reformation Christianity. But I think that you made a good point. It's really about a very important way of God taking care of his people and his providence being shown. And, we tend to read books like Esther, like journalistic history. We search for, hey, we're trying to figure out the history of what happened. And we sometimes we miss the theological value of the book. And ancient history was not written like modern day Western history. It was really written as great literature to tell a story and to tell it with certain emphasis. I would make the argument that the same is for the Gospels and Acts in the New Testament. Not concerned with history of this happened at this date and right after this had happened. I think, the gospel writers have things in different order. And I don't think that's any big deal because they're not trying to write sequential journalistic history. They're trying to write theological literature. And I think we fail to understand that sometimes. And I think critics of the Bible fail to understand that as well. And there's a heavy importance to this book, an encouraging book. Think about how many generations of Jews have probably been encouraged by this book when they faced persecution, because they have faced persecution for far longer and in far greater scope than any Christians ever faced, especially at the time of the Holocaust. There's never been a time when 5 million, 6 million Christians have been rounded up and gassed to death and put into furnaces and gas chambers.
Yeah. There's a couple big things that I see here, like in the value of the book is one, I think, especially for our culture, we're so focused on the individual. And for the Jews, ever since the beginning, like there is a community, you have a responsibility to the community. And that's a theme that I see here in Esther, that it's not just what's best for you, but what is best for your people, like for your God's people here. But the other part of it is like that I think would be encouraging to the people is no matter if it's the beginning of the story or the middle of the story, what seems like those that have power and what seems like those that are at the lowest of lows, like the end of the story can be vastly different. Like, and you see that, and that's like a repeated theme that I see in the Old Testament there, especially highlighted here. Just Mordecai is like this person that's just at the gate, no power, ends up second in control. The guy that's gloating about, oh, I'm like on top of the world under the king, ends up in 24 hours like he's lost everything. So it's like for those that are persecuted, for those that are struggling, like you don't know how the story is going to end. So keep faithful, like keep doing the right thing. And for us as Christians, we know whether it's not necessarily here on this life, but in the end, like there will be reward. There will be victory. We will be victorious. Like things will work out for good in the end if we stay faithful to God's promises.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of terms that are very important in our Bible study, both of the Old Testament and New Testament, and is the community viewpoint. What's best for the community. And even Eastern societies today, they have to think about what's best for the community. We tend to think very individualistically. I would say that most Americans, if the king of Persia had said, I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom, they would have gone the half my kingdom route.
Yeah.
They would not have looked out for their fellow person.
And that's rarely mentioned about Esther.
Yeah, that's right. She
sacrificed, or she risked her life, but she also gave up
anything.
Whatever she could have wanted.
He's obviously smitten with her. And I mean, I think Esther was hot. I mean, I just hate to say it, but she was pretty good looking. But I think that's important for us to remember. In the immortal wisdom of Captain Spock, sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And that's what Esther is doing here. She may have needs preserving her life, or even perhaps a chance to ask the king for whatever she wanted as far as wealth or whatever status she wanted. She instead risked her life for the betterment of her community as a whole. For many people, she didn't even know. I mean, there's Jews by the end of the story. We're talking about Jews throughout the Persian Empire, which is a massive empire that stretches all the way from modern day India all the way to Greece and Egypt, and takes into account probably like 20 different modern day countries. Jews across that were saved, the text tells us, because of her efforts. And 75,000 other citizens of the Persian Empire get killed. She was community minded, and that's how folks like that thought. What's the good folks? What's the betterment of the community? Whereas we as Westerners tend to think about me, myself, and I versus, okay, what's better for everybody in the community, and even if it means sacrificing things of my own, or putting my status and wealth aside.
My closing thought, I'll give this: for a book that doesn't mention God, it does a good job of summarizing what Jesus said was the summary of the Old Testament. That's to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
I would say that's right.
Hey, as we conclude this final season, don't hesitate to final episode.
I got my contract renewed. Maybe you didn't.
Yeah. Well, I'm still pending, I guess. The final episode of the season, don't hesitate to reach out by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We will hope you will join us in the fall.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.